Welcome to SysEng Quick. My name is John, and today I'll show you how to apply SSH options to your Ansible connections. It is common to firewall SSH traffic from the internet on most production servers, and only permit that traffic from trusted hosts, known as proxy, jump, or bastion hosts. We can use the proxy jump option to connect through our proxy into a server. Let's see how we can configure Ansible with the proxy jump SSH option. In VS Code, I've got the inventory file open. Under our LXC group, we now have two new groups, proxy and servers. Proxy is for the proxies we'll use to connect into our servers. I've got 4 servers here, a Debian 12 host, a Rocky 9 host, a Fedora host, and an Arch Linux host. Let's try running this ping playbook to see if we can connect to our hosts. We'll go to the terminal and run Ansible playbook syseng quick tutorial.ping. And as expected, we can't connect to any host other than our proxy host. It can't even resolve the host name. So let's go back to our inventory and add some SSH connection arguments. Under our servers group, we want to add some vars. We don't want to proxy in our proxy. That would be recursive and wouldn't work well at all. So we need to make sure we add the vars here in this group applying to these hosts, not here applying to all of our LXC hosts. So the variable we want to add is called Ansible SSH common args. Now there is another argument called Ansible SSH args, but those are for the default Ansible SSH connection arguments. If you just want to add an argument, put them in the common args. If you want to override Ansible's defaults, that's when you'd use Ansible SSH args. So I recommend you stick to Ansible SSH common args and leave Ansible's defaults alone. Let's add the argument -J, which is the proxy jump argument for current versions of OpenSSH. We're going to supply the user, which is Ansible. This is the user we want to connect into our proxy with. And we'll say at ath-proxy.localtechnoplaza.net. This is our proxy host. Let's go see if this works now. Going back to the terminal, let's run the ping playbook again. Well, it's different, but it's not better. They're still unreachable, but there's a new error, permission denied. You know, these LXC containers are all brand new. I haven't set up that non-root user, so there is no Ansible user on any of these hosts. We'll have to fix that. But for now, let's just use our root command and get in there instead. So we need to change the Ansible SSH user, but we don't want to change that for our proxy host, only for these hosts. So again, I'll place that variable here. Ansible SSH user is going to be root. Now because this variable is closer than this one, this will shadow this definition, and this one will be applied to these hosts, while this one will be applied to this host. So let's go back to the command line and see if we can finally ping our hosts. Hey, there we go. Everything looks good now. Okay, we can connect to all of our hosts, but I don't want to connect to these hosts as the root user. Let's see if we can run our non-root setup play against these hosts. We don't need to run it against every LXC host every time though. Let's make our host a bit more flexible with some Jinja templating. Let's say I want to use the targets variable, and we will default to LXC if it's not supplied. So let's save that, and let's see if we can run this playbook on our command line. We'll run the playbook syseng quick tutorial non-root setup, and we'll supply the variable targets, and we're going to say the targets are servers. Let's see how this works. Everything appears to be working just fine. Let's go ahead and go back to our inventory, and let's try to remove this Ansible SSH user and just use the Ansible user. We'll go ahead and save that. We'll go to the command line, and we'll try to run that ping playbook again with the Ansible user. Yeah, now it all works. So we should be able to use our Ansible user going forward with all of these hosts. Now that we have an Arch Linux server, it might be nice to add Arch support to our package cache role. Let's go to the CLI and see if we can gather some facts about this host. We can run Ansible-m setup to run the setup module, and we'll gather a subset of facts which only includes the OS family. We'll run it against the Arch host. If we go ahead and do that, we'll see that Ansible OS family equals Arch Linux with a capital A. Let's go back to our role, and let's add this to our supported families. We'll say Arch Linux with a capital A. We'll go ahead and copy that, and we'll make a new task file, which is going to be archlinux.yml. Again, don't forget the capital A. We'll go ahead and copy this part from Debian, and we'll need to run not apt, but pacman. And that's not a built-in. It's actually from the community general collection. So we'll do community.general.pacman, updating the cache of true. Okay, now we should be able to update the cache on Arch Linux systems. Let's go ahead and run our non-root playbook again, but this time I want to target only the Arch host. We can do that by name, but we don't have to type out the entire name. We can do arch star, which will target anything that starts with Arch. We only have one host like that, so this should be a good target. Let's go ahead and run this playbook. And you can see that this time it did update the cache on Arch Linux, or at least it would have if the cache weren't already updated. In the previous video, we created this getConfig role to template our getConfig file. But we have a lot of hard-coded variables in this playbook. I think we could do a bit better with this role. Let's go make a new playbook specific to getConfig. We'll call it getconfig.yaml. And here we're going to add our first play, which is template our getConfig file. We're going to run it against targets, and we're not going to supply any default targets. You'll have to supply them on the CLI. Let's say we don't want to gather facts right now. We'll set that to false. Now we'll add some task, and our task is going to be template getConfig. Again, we're just going to run that role. The role name is sysengquick tutorial.getConfig. I'm not going to add any arguments yet. First, we'll make some changes to the role. Let's go over to our File Explorer. We'll go down to our getConfig role, and we'll make a new file in meta, argument_specs.yaml. We need to specify what arguments we're passing to this role. So our top level key is going to be argument specs. We only have one task file, that's main. We can give it a short description, which is templates getConfig file. And if we had a longer description, we can add that too. So I'll say template getConfig according to supplied user arguments or parameters, whatever. We can add an author key. Again, that's going to be me. And now we have our options. Here's going to be the heart of our argument spec. So I want to supply a dictionary of all of our options because it'll be easier to supply that from a variable file, which we can read from the command line. So let's say I want the argument getConfig_values. And we're going to give it a type, and the type is going to be a dictionary. This is going to be a dictionary of dictionary. We're going to say elements are also dictionaries. And then we're going to say this is required. We can't not pass the values. We don't have a default. We do have a description, the getConfig values. Now we can supply our sub options for our elements dictionary. So again, we have a new options key, and these are all the sub keys in our first dictionary. I've mapped out these values according to the sections I want to appear in my getConfig file. The top section is going to be the user section. So here is our first dictionary key. Again, it is dictionary of dictionary. And the elements, again, are going to be dictionaries. We do require this, so we'll say it's true. And description is the user section properties. Now we can give more sub options. And here, our first option is going to be name. The type of name is just going to be a string. We finally come to our first actual value. It's the name property. We're going to say the name is required, and we'll give it a description, the get username. Our other key is going to be email. Again, it's of type string, it is required, and the description is the get user's email. The next section I want to add is the pull section. So we'll put that at the same level as the user key, right there. And I've got the indent highlight turned on so you can see that a little bit easier. So again, this is going to be a type of dictionary, and the elements are going to be dictionaries themselves. This is not going to be a required section, so we'll say we could be false. We're not going to have a default value though. If we don't supply this section, we simply won't have any arguments in here. We'll give it a description, the pull section properties, and then we're going to give our sub options. There's only going to be one. I like to get pull with rebase, so we'll make a rebase option. So here is my option. The type is Boolean. It's going to be true or false. It is not going to be required. The default is going to be false. And we'll give it a description. Okay, there's our pull section. Next, we'll have the alias section. And this is going to be a type list, because this will be a list of dictionaries. So the elements are going to be dictionaries. Required, again, is going to be false. The default value is just the empty array. For my description, we're going to say the get aliases to add. And then we'll have our sub options. The fields in our alias dictionaries are going to be name and command. So name is of type string, it is required, and the description is name of the get alias. Our next option is going to be the command. Again, it's of type string, it is required, so let's set that to be true. And then our description is going to be get alias command. Okay, that covers our alias section. So let's go back over here to our indented section up here. Our next section I want to do is editor. This isn't actually a get section, but I want to be able to use VS Code or Nano or Vim or whatever and take some action based on this. We're going to add a property to our get config values for editor. The type of this is going to be a string. We're not going to make it required, and there is no default value. If you don't supply an editor, it simply won't add anything to the get config. So description is going to be which editor to use with Git. There is one last property I want to add here. It is the credential section. I want to be able to add Git credential helpers. So let's go ahead and add this as well. It's going to be a list, and the elements are going to be dictionaries. So inside every dictionary, we're going to have a URL and then some options for that credential. We're not going to have any required, so this will be false, and the default will be an empty array. So now we come down to our options, or actually we should do our description first. Description is credential helpers to use with Git. Now we come to our options, and the first option is URL. This is going to be a type string. It is going to be required. And description is the URL to associate with this credential helper. So our next parameter is going to be options. This is going to be a list of key value pair dictionaries. It's going to be a type list. The element is going to be dictionaries. And we're going to have it be required if we pass one of these. is required. There's no default value. Description is the get credential options. Now we're going to give it the options for each of our dictionaries. And we're going to have simply one that says key, which is a type of string. It is required. And the description is going to be the key for the credential option. Then we'll have the value. It'll be of type string. Required will be true. And description is the value for the credential option. Okay, I think that's everything for our argument specs. Now that we have a formal argument spec, let's apply that to our Jinja template. We need to change some of these parameters in our user section. So we'll say get config values. In the user section, we want the name property, and that should be good for that value. We can change email similarly. We just use the email property instead. Now here we no longer have get config use VS Code, so let's replace that. I want to know, did we specify an editor at all? So I'll say if get config editor, and then inside this we'll take action based on whether the editor was VS Code. So we'll add another if condition. So if get config editor equals VS Code, then I want to add this section here. And if it doesn't equal VS Code, we'll simply add the editor section down here. Let's go ahead and move this core over here, and then we'll simply add the editor right in here. And this time our editor is going to be the Jinja expression for the get config editor. That should take care of our editor section, whether we have VS Code or we specify something like Nano, Vim, or Emacs. Down here in our aliases, I think all we need to do is change getConfig aliases to getConfig values for the alias section, and then we renamed this property from value to command. So I believe that looks good for our argument spec. There are two more sections we added to our argument spec, one for the pull rebase property and one for our credentials. And also, I'm realizing I also forgot to add another end if clause right here for our second if, so I'll go ahead and do that there. Let's go ahead and go up here and let's make a section for pull. Now, if we have rebase, we want to set pull there. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's say rebase equals, and we'll give it the Jinja print expression of getConfig values pull rebase. That should be good for our rebase section. So the last thing to handle is our credential helpers. Let's go ahead and go down and put those in here. So we're going to say for every helper in getConfig values credential, we want to do something. And we'll go ahead and end our for statement. Our credential section starts with credential, and then we qualify that with our URL in quotes. We're going to print a Jinja expression for our helper URL. Let's go ahead and copy that and do helper for URL. Then we need to loop over all of the options inside our helper. So let's make another for statement for option in helper options. And we'll go ahead and end the for. Don't forget to do that. And then we'll indent this. And we're going to say option name, actually I think it's key, equals option value. And there we go. I believe that's everything for our new template. Back in our argument specs, we have defaults defined for some of our properties, like pull rebase, the alias array, the editor defaulting to none, and the credential list should be empty. How can we supply these defaults while not supplying other defaults? And if we supply a getConfig values, will it not override all of our defaults? Yes, it will. By default, Ansible does not do any kind of deep hash merging. We're going to have to work around that. Let's go to our File Explorer, and we'll make a new folder in our getConfig role called vars, and we're going to have main.yaml. Vars are another way of adding variables to a role. They have much higher precedence than defaults and are not meant to be overridden. We're going to supply our default values here, and I'll show you how we'll combine them with our user properties to create a complete getConfig values. So we're going to start by giving it a property. Again, all variables inside a role start with the name of the role, so getConfig underscore, and then I'm going to say values defaults. So we need to supply default values for everything we told it there would be defaults for in argument specs. That's going to be the pull section with the rebase of false. We've got the alias section, which is an empty array, the credential, which is an empty array, and the editor is going to be empty or none. So we'll supply the default none. You could leave this blank and that would be the same thing in YAML, but I prefer to make it explicit with the tilde. Now we have our getConfig value defaults. How can we combine these things to add our getConfig defaults? In order to supply custom values over our defaults, I'm going to change the name in our template from getConfig values to simply values. Let's go ahead and highlight everything there, and we'll change that to values. This way we can supply a values variable which combines our defaults with our supplied arguments. We'll go back into our vars file to grab the name of our defaults, and then in our task we're going to supply a var to our template called values. We're going to use a Jinja expression, and we're going to pipe this into Ansible built-in.combine. This is a filter that allows us to combine dictionaries together. Our first property is going to be the values we want to combine onto our values defaults, which is going to be getConfig values. And then we're going to give it a property of recursive equals true. Now we'll be able to supply values which combine our defaults with whatever values were supplied from the user. We're finally ready to supply variables when we import our role. To do that, we're going to look up the variables from a file. Let's make that file. We'll go in our templates folder. We'll make a new folder called vars. Under that, one for getConfig. I'm just going to call this ansible.yaml. This will have all of our properties for our Ansible configuration. So let's go ahead and make that file. And this is simply anything you want to place in that argument spec. So we need a user section. That is required. We need to supply a name, so I'll give it mine. And then an email address. Again, I'll give it mine. Let's see how the defaults work. For now, I'll add this pull section, but we'll comment it out. So I'll say rebase is true, but for now, we're just going to comment this filled out. We'll see how it works later on. And now let's add one of our get aliases. This is an array of objects. We have a name property, which is one line, and a command property, which is log -- one line. There's our alias. Now we can add our credential section. This is another array. We're going to have a URL. In this case, it's going to be for anything on github.com. And then we have an options property under that, and that is also an array with a key, which is username, and a value, which is going to be my username for GitHub, which maybe it's that, I don't know. We need another key. That's going to be the helper. In this case, my helper is going to be the cache helper with a timeout of 14,400, which I think is 12 hours, but I don't remember. Anyway, this is basically how I would lay out my Git configuration. Let's supply our vars to our role. The var we need to supply is called getConfig values, and we're going to supply it a Jinja expression. We need to look up the values from our file. We're going to use the lookup plugin file from Ansible built-in collection. And the file we want to look up is in vars/getconfig/ansible.yaml. But let's make this a little bit more generic. Maybe you don't want the Ansible file. Maybe you want a user you specify. So let's see how we can do that. Now we're already inside a Jinja expression, and we're in a string here. So I can't put more of these in here. Even if I do that, this is not valid. So how are we going to get around that? Well, rather than using another Jinja expression, what we're going to do is we're going to use string concatenation here. So in Jinja, you can concatenate two strings with the tilde operator. So we'll say vars slash getconfig slash global getconfig user, and we'll supply a default of Ansible if they don't give one on the command line. And then we'll append that with .yaml. So there is our vars file, which will default to ansible.yaml. And then we need to convert this from YAML into a dictionary. We did the from JSON filter last time. There's also a from YAML filter, which will allow us to parse YAML files. Okay, this looks good. I think we're finally ready to run our template and see what happens. Let's go to the command line, and let's try running Ansible playbook sysng tutorial getconfig, and we're going to say the targets are bookworm star. We're going to target just that one Debian host for testing. Let's go ahead and run this, and we changed our config. Let's go see if the config looks good. So here we are over on the bookworm host. If I cat getconfig, yeah, and rebase is set to false. I'm not actually sure if get can handle the capital F in there. We may have to fix that, but we'll leave it for now. So our default did get applied and everything else was fine. Our editor is not set to VS Code. I must have forgot to do that. Let's go ahead and close this, and let's go fix some of our values. So first of all, let's add an editor property and set it to VS Code. But the nice thing was that it didn't actually give us any default editor section. So at least the default of being nothing did work. Let's go ahead and also uncomment out our pull section and make sure this all works. We'll go back to the command line. We'll run our playbook one more time. It did that. Let's do Ansible, and we'll target bookworm star. We'll do the shell module, and we'll do cat tilde.getconfig. I forgot the -a property. There we go. That looks good. We have pull rebase being true, and we now have our VS Code section. Everything is looking good with our new template. Real quick before we go, I want to point out one fix I made off camera. Originally, when we wrote the argument specs, I added this elements key to all of the type dictionaries. You don't want the elements key here. It's only for the list type. So any place I added the elements where there's a type dictionary, just take that out. I have already done that. I hope you found today's video helpful. If you did, please hit those like and subscribe buttons. It really helps the channel grow, and I'd personally appreciate it. Thanks for watching. See you next time.